The Book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Hebrew Bible and the fourth of 5 books of the Hebrew Torah. The book has a long and complex history. Its final form is probably due to a priestly redaction, meaning a redaction from a Yahwistic source, made sometime in the early Persian period, 5th century before Christ. The name of the book comes from the 2 censuses of the Israelites. Numbers is one of the best preserved books of the Pentateuch. Fragments of the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, containing verses from Numbers, have been dated to the late 7th or early 6th century before Christ. These verses are the earliest known artifacts found in the text of the Hebrew Bible. Numbers begins at Mount Sinai, where the Israelites received their laws and covenant from God, and God dwelt among them in the sanctuary. Their task is to conquer the promised land. The people are numbered and prepared to resume the march. The Israelites begin the journey, but complain about the difficulties of the journey and the authority of Moses and Aaron. They arrive at the borders of Canaan and send 12 spies into the land. After hearing the spies' dire report about conditions in Canaan, the Israelites refuse to conquer it. God sentences them to death in the wilderness until a new generation grows up to fulfill the task. There were also some who rebelled against Moses, and for these actions God destroyed approximately 15,000 of them by various means. The book ends with the new generation of Israelites on the plains of Moab, ready to cross the Jordan River. The Book of Numbers is the culmination of the story of Israel's exodus from oppression in Egypt and their journey to possess the land that God had promised their fathers. As such, the book draws to a conclusion the themes introduced in Genesis and played out in Exodus and Leviticus. God promised the Israelites that they would become a great and numerous nation, that they would have a special relationship with Him, and that they would possess the land of Canaan. Numbers also shows the importance of holiness, faithfulness, and trust, despite God's presence and His priests. Israel lacks faith, and possession of the land is left to a new generation. Most commentators divide Numbers into 3 sections based on location: Mount Sinai, Kadesh Barnea, and the plains of Moab, connected by 2 travel sections. The alternative is to see the book as structured around the 2 generations of those condemned to die in the wilderness and the new generation that will enter Canaan, making a theological distinction between the disobedience of the first generation and the obedience of the second. Despite the strong chronological order and the clear distinction of the 3 geographical locations, the key theme of the censuses among the Israelites and the parallels between the old and new generation seem more appropriate for this book if viewed as a theological narrative rather than as a purely historical one. Most modern biblical scholars believe that the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy reached its present form in the post-exilic period, that is, after about 520 before Christ, based on existing written and oral traditions, as well as contemporary geographical and political realities. The 5 books are often described as drawn from further sources, usually considered to be the work of schools of writers rather than individuals. The Yahwist and Elohist, often treated as one source, the priestly source, and Deuteronomy. There is ongoing debate about the origin of the non-priestly source, but it is generally accepted that the priestly source is post-exilic. Genesis is composed of priestly and non-priestly material. Exodus is an anthology collected from almost all periods of Israel's history. Leviticus is entirely priestly and dates from the exilic post-exilic period. Numbers is a priestly redaction, that is, a redaction of a non-priestly original. Deuteronomy, now the last book of the Torah, began as a set of religious laws that make up the bulk of the book, was expanded in the early 6th century before Christ to serve as an introduction to Deuteronomy, the books from Joshua to Kings, and was later still separated from that history, expanded and redacted again, and attached to the Torah. However, the Ketef Hinnom scrolls indicate the plausibility of a pre-exilic written tradition for the passages in Numbers chapter 6 and Deuteronomy chapter 7. While this does not prove conclusively that there was a canonical written tradition, it does point to the possibility of such a tradition. David Kleins, in his influential Themes of the Pentateuch, 1978, identifies the main theme of the 5 books as the partial fulfillment of a promise made by God to the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promise has 3 elements: seed, that is, Abraham's descendants were said to be as numerous as the stars in the sky; divine-human relationship, Israel was to be God's chosen people; and land, the land of Canaan, cursed by Noah immediately after the flood. The theme of the divine-human relationship is expressed or governed by a series of covenants, meaning contracts, legally binding agreements, extending from Genesis to Deuteronomy and beyond. The first is the covenant between God and Noah immediately after the flood, in which God agrees never again to destroy the earth with water. The next is between God and Abraham, and the third is between God and all of Israel at Mount Sinai. In this third covenant, unlike the first 2, God gives a complex set of laws, scattered throughout Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, that the Israelites must keep. They must also remain faithful to Yahweh, the God of Israel, which means, among other things, that they must trust in His help. It is important to note that among the reasons for this law was to establish the people of Israel as Yahweh's people. The laws and instructions were as much about identity as they were about obedience. By providing all the various instructions and laws, Yahweh was confirming that the people of Israel were His and would carry His identity. The theme of posterity marks the first event in Numbers, the census of Israel's fighting men. The enormous number that is obtained, over 600,000, demonstrates the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham of countless descendants, as well as serving as God's guarantee of victory in Canaan. As chapters 1 through 10 progress, the theme of God's presence with Israel comes to the fore. These chapters describe how Israel was to be organized around the sanctuary, God's dwelling place in their midst, under the leadership of the Levites and priests, in preparation for the conquest of the land. The Israelites then set out to conquer the land, but almost immediately they refused to enter it, and God condemns the entire generation that left Egypt to die in the wilderness. The message is clear: the failure is not due to any failure in preparation, for God had foreseen everything, but because of Israel's sin of unfaithfulness. In the final section, the Israelites of the new generation follow God's instructions given through Moses and succeed in all their endeavors. The last 5 chapters deal exclusively with the land, instructions for the destruction of the Canaanites, the demarcation of the boundaries of the land, how the land should be divided, holy cities for the Levites and cities of refuge, the problem of blood contamination of the land, and rules for inheritance when there is no male heir. A major theological theme in Numbers is the righteousness and holiness of God met with human rebellion. The 2 censuses show not only the different reactions of 2 generations, but rather that God remained faithful despite the rebellion of the Israelites. The theme of the book seems to be more centrally focused on the faithfulness and holiness of God, as this is a common theme that runs throughout the Pentateuch, not just in the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers describes in some detail the fighting population of Israel, providing a figure of approximately 600,000 soldiers. This would imply a total population of 1.5 to 2.5 million Israelites. However, scholars have proposed numerous alternatives, as such a large number of Israelites does not fit with modern historical knowledge of the period or archaeological evidence. Some scholars view the Book of Numbers as unhistorical, and the figures given as grossly exaggerated or simply fabricated, choosing instead to focus on Numbers as a theological book rather than a historical one. On the other hand, some biblical scholars speculate that the literature does not refer to an actual number, and that the word for 1,000 actually refers to a noun denoting a group or clan. This interpretation, however, poses a problem, as it undermines the validity of the text, implies a misunderstanding and mistransmission of the text in all the census lists of Exodus and Numbers, to say nothing of other texts, and creates several inconsistencies in the Book of Numbers that cannot be resolved. Most scholars who hold this view assign a much lower number for the fighting men of Israel, closer to 20,000. Another theory is that of a transmission error, with Wenham arguing that biblical texts are often corrupted by the simple addition of zeros to numbers, although the drawback to this assumption is that the zero error would only arise readily when numbers were represented in figures rather than words, and there is little or no evidence that numerals were used in biblical texts during the biblical period. Based on the nature of the book and its many tax accounts and records of animals and people, it is likely that Numbers refers to an actual account of a census of the people of Israel. A more likely explanation for the large numbers given in the book is that the actual figures cannot really be ascertained today. This requires us to accept the figures given as they are, since any other alternative raises more problems than it solves. In his commentary on Numbers, John Calvin acknowledged that even among his contemporaries some skeptics doubted the accuracy of the figures quoted, but he defended the inerrancy of the text by referring to the miraculous intervention of God. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Moses Film channel and give the video a thumbs up in support.